listening to The Trident, a podcast on irregular warfare and related issues in the international security environment. The Trident is sponsored by the U.S. Naval War College's Center on Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, retired Army Colonel Dave Brown, and Director of the Center on Irregular Warfare here at the college. Well, welcome back to the Trident podcast. On today's episode, we're starting something new. We're going to do a 3-book series focused on a set of modern irregular warfare operations over control of southern Yemen in 2025. I'm joined today by my co-host, Jane Stokes. Jane serves as an associate professor in the Joint Military Operations Department and the College of Distance Education here at the Naval War College. She's also a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, having served 25 years in both active and reserve components. As a military officer, Jane served as a Marine foreign advisor, an attaché, a liaison officer in numerous embassies. She served as International Programs Branch Chief for the CENTCOM J2, working on security cooperation efforts and partner engagements. And before that was the MARCENT Liaison Officer to the United Arab Emirates. An Arabic speaker, she also spent almost a decade working for Department of State's Foreign Service and has extensive experience in the Middle East with a focus on counterterrorism and foreign policy. She holds an MA from American Military University in Strategic Intelligence and an MA in National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College. Jane is also the author of Hesitation Kills, a female Marines officer's combat experience in Iraq, which is featured on the Marine Corps Commandant's professional reading list, and she has appeared in numerous national media outlets. And our main guest today is the author of 25 Days to Aden, the distinguished Dr. Michael Knights, who serves as the Bernstein Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, specializing in military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf states. He is the co-founder of the Militia Spotlight platform, which offers in-depth analysis of developments related to Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria. Michael has traveled widely in Iraq, Yemen, the Gulf states, regularly have briefed government policymakers, congressional committees, and U.S. military and regional security affairs. He's worked extensively and been embedded with local military and security agencies on the ground in Iraq and the Gulf states and in Yemen. And he previously worked as the head of analysis for a range of security and oil companies, directing information collection teams in Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. Before that, he actually worked as a defense journalist for the Gulf States newsletter, as well as Jane's Intelligence Review. Michael has written and published for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Journal of Strategic Studies, West Point Counterterrorism Center's The Sentinel, as well as other policy news outlets. He holds a doctorate from the Department of War Studies in King's College, London. And welcome you both to the podcast. We've entitled today's episode, 25 Days to Aden, which is the unknown story of Arabian elite forces at war, a book series with Michael Knights. And we plan on having 2 follow-on sessions later this year with Dr. Knights on the other 2 books in this series. The first book, 25 Days to Aden, details the outcome of a set of modern irregular warfare operations, as I said earlier, over southern control of Yemen in southern Yemen in 2015. And this first book details the Yemeni Houthis' attempts to take over the port of Aden after their coup against the UN-backed government of the country. The opposing force preventing this Iranian proxy from threatening a second major strategic waterway and potential impacting global trade through Suez were the small but highly capable UAE special forces that had been honed alongside NATO and the U.S. in the fires of Afghanistan. Michael, it's great to have you here with Jane and I today. As we start, how did you come to write the book, and what interested you, or what kind of prompted you on this 3-book series and the writing of it?
So thanks very much for having me, and for all of the important work your center does. I loved Yemen from the first time I visited there. back in the early 2000s. I spent periods of a number of years there in the mid-2000s and grew to know the country really well. When the new war began in 2015, as the Iran-backed Houthis tried to take over the capital and then the entire country, I became interested again and started to travel to Yemen again, including time embedded with the UAE, Saudi, and Yemeni forces inside the country. As I was embedded with these forces, you have a lot of time in the evenings. You sit with them, you talk about previous operations they've done. And it occurred to me that the initial battle for Aden in 2015, the first battle of the war, was really worthy of a book. And then as I started to learn more about that battle and got more exposed to UAE soldiers as they became more comfortable talking to an outsider about military operations, it became clear that there might be other books that one could add to the end, looking at first the war in the east of Yemen, which is the second book, Race for McCullough, and then the book that I'm writing at the moment, The Battle for the Red Sea, which is about the attempts to liberate the Red Sea coast of Yemen, where we see so much fighting at the moment, including a major U.S. operation, Rough Rider.
So both of you spent a lot of time in this region, and I know that some of our listening audience, they don't have access to the beautiful maps that are in the book, and we don't have a map in front of us today. So, but let's describe for our listening base, and some of our listeners may end up being kind of on a radio listening to kind of podcasts. So just how can we shape a word picture of the geography of Yemen, the capital, maybe some aspects of where it sits and some of the major geographical features? And Jane, jump in here as you want to.
Great.
So Yemen is right at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, underneath south of Saudi Arabia and adjacent to Oman in the east. It's on the Red Sea, which we all know is the point where the Suez Canal will connect the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. It's also got significant coastlines on the Indian Ocean as well.
Which is really the Gulf of Aden.
That's right. Yeah, the Gulf of Aden off to the south of the city and port of Aden, gets its name from that city and port, and it blends into the Indian Ocean as we get kind of out from the Horn of Africa. So that geographic location has made Yemen a connecting point between east and west for a long time. First, via land. So if you think about things like frankincense, myrrh, coffee, cinnamon, all of these things came to Western civilization through Yemen, through its coastal Silk Route. And then later, when the Suez Canal was created in the 1850s, Yemen suddenly found itself on the world's new maritime superhighway. And so its port of Aden became one of the busiest ports in the world, rivaling even ports like New York until the 1940s. So, it's a very rugged tribal culture where the interior is mountainous and it has a flat coastal belt, quite wide coastal belt along the edges.
That's on the southern edge, on the Gulf of Aden, on that southern...
But also the Red Sea as well. The Red Sea coast has a wide, broad, well-watered agricultural belt as well. So you have the interior of Yemen, the mountains, where, for instance, the Iran-backed Houthis come from. And then you have the coastal belt on the outside with all the ports.
As I studied Yemen, I was always impressed that all of the towns on the coast are named after the agricultural center. So you have like Kokha and Mocha, which are like peaches and coffee. Mm-hmm. So they're all named after agricultural produce that presumably they traded.
And so there's actually two ports on the Red Sea, two major ports, and two major ports on the southern coast on the Gulf of Aden.
That's right. Yeah, you've got Aden and you have Mukalla, the pearl of the Indian Ocean, the latter on the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean, and then you have Hodeidah and Ras Isa Salif complex on the Red Sea coast.
And of course, our most important Bab el-Mandeb, that strategic point that connects the bottom of the Suez and has, of course, been in modern news for the significance of that strategic point that has been subject to all those Houthi attacks on maritime traffic.
So these are two great restricted waterways, one which is on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz that is sat over by the country of Iran, and then the strait that you were just talking about, which is a narrow passage leading in from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea. And
choke point.
The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, is that how you...
Okay. Right, Strait of Tears.
And the capital of Yemen, so was not Aden. Talk about that for a second.
Well, that's right. So since unification of the country in 1990, or during the early 90s, it went back and forth. There was a small civil war. Sanaa has been the capital of the unified Yemen, and Sanaa is inland. It's up in the mountains, and it's known for being or it's one of the places that's known for being the Manhattan of the Middle East, because it has these amazing earth and mud skyscrapers, beautifully decorated and coloured, which can rise to be 4, 5, 6 stories tall. So it's a very picturesque, ancient capital. And of course, as we come to 2015, it's one of the 4 capitals in the Middle East, 4 Arab capitals that the Iranians say that they have now taken over, which include Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and now Sanaa, when the Iran-backed Houthis take over in late 2014.
And so all of which are controlled by Iranian proxy forces. So you have Hezbollah, sitting on top of Beirut in Lebanon. And of course, there's been a lot that's happened in Syria, and what has transpired there. Hezbollah has taken some losses relative to Damascus, but then the Houthis are a partner with Iran. And do you pronounce it Sanaa or?
I'm not the person to ask really, but with being a Brit, but yes.
Okay. And so as we get into the story, let's also talk a little bit about the major actors, and certainly some background maybe on the Houthis themselves, and maybe some background on UAE and how they got involved, but also the former president of Yemen before this kind of transfer of power took place. And if we could get some description of that a little bit, kind of sets up the story of what the Houthis are trying to accomplish.
Well, so in all 3 of the books, there has to be a part at the beginning where you get people up to speed on who exactly is fighting and over what. And I'll do that briefly here. So in Yemen, in the Arab Spring in 2011, we had the overthrow of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the long-lasting president stroke dictator of Yemen, who had not been subjected to a real election ever at any point. And
this was the Yemeni government prior to the government that is there now.
That's correct, yes. So the Arab Spring overthrew the long-term leader of Yemen. And what we then had was a couple of years after the Arab Spring where the UN built a very weak placeholder government. But at the same time, the Iranians began to support the Houthis in the north as they began to expand. And then eventually in 2014, they did a coup against the internationally recognized government of Yemen and took over the capital of Sanaa. And that then left the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and indeed external partners like the Americans, with a decision. Do we leave the Houthis in charge of the center of Yemen with most of its population and its capital and its international airport? Or do we do something about that? Do we remove them from that?
So let's just step back just a little bit on this timeline. So if we went back to Yemen had its independence from who, when?
And so to go back to the beginning.
In the modern sense.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'm not going to go back to the Sabaean
ancient
empire. But, in the modern sense, as late as the early 1960s, Yemen was it was a multitude of political entities. There were 2 British confederations, British-backed confederations, in each of which broke down into numerous emirates, kingdoms, sultanates, and republics. And then there was a northern Yemen that was run by an imamate. What basically then happened was a process of consolidation over a 30-year period whereby the Brits withdrew.
Right.
The southern and eastern parts of Yemen became a USSR Soviet-backed republic, and the north became another Arab republic backed by Egypt. And then at a point between 1990 and 1994, the two became one Yemen. But the people of the south were not particularly happy with their incorporation into the north, and they were never really treated fairly. So there was a lot of discontent about that union, and a lot of buyer's regret in the south that they entered into one unified Yemen. I don't know if you would.
Yeah, I heard it referred to as the patronage system is how I feel it's referred to a lot. You know, this tribal infighting, but also sort of a trade of political power in order to sort of placate one political entity. Are you familiar with that term?
Well, so sometimes they call Yemen the tribal republic, meaning that it's a nation state, and its military has a very, very strong tribal element to it. In other words, the tribes use the government and the military to structure their patronage systems. There is a state, but in reality, it's run by very powerful tribal confederations.
But when, and just another point of historical reference here, for the U.S., the attack on the USS Cole took place out of one of these ports.
Yeah, I mean, the way most Americans or Westerners have encountered Yemen, particularly since the new millennia, is in terms of counterterrorism. Because in addition to this growing contest between the government and the Houthi movement, backed by Iran eventually, we also have always had a significant al-Qaeda in Yemen presence. In fact, you know, a lot of key al-Qaeda leadership come from mixed Saudi Yemeni families. A lot of the al-Qaeda guys who were kicked out of Afghanistan in the first couple of years after 9/11 went to Yemen. And a lot of the al-Qaeda elements that were kind of driven out of Saudi Arabia in 2003 to 2005 also fell back into Yemen. And so, you know, one of the reasons we know that, I mean, al-Qaeda's first attack was in Yemen against international forces. It was down in Aden, actually, at a hotel that was housing US forces who were involved in the Somalia intervention back in the early 90s. The USS Cole, a warship that's still rolling around to this day, doing very well, was holed by a al-Qaeda suicide bombing in the suicide boat in the port of Aden back in October 2000.
Okay, and then just as we get farther along in that history, so there's a civil war, and the outcome of that civil war was this then government, the previous government than the one today, and they had purchased tanks and armored equipment, and so they had been around in that government after the Civil War, controlling Yemen, capitals up in the mountains, but they had significant military hardware.
So the way I'd phrase it is that the Arab Spring shattered what little cohesion the government had. It was always a weak government that could control the center, but its power started to blur at the edges of its, particularly when you got away from northern Yemen.
Right.
Now, but they had a lot of hardware because in the 80s, Yemen started to make a decent amount of oil, and it went from having no money to having lots in comparison to previous times. It spent a lot of that on Soviet military hardware. The Arab Spring happened. The fabric of the country loosened a lot, and the various parts of the country that had existed before the 1960s and before the 90s unification started to pull the country apart at the seams. A UN effort was made to hold it together under one UN-backed president, but it never worked particularly well. And before that process could work, the Iranians backed one particular set of northern tribes, the Houthis, and they marched into the capital of Sanaa in 2014, and they took it over. And what the book of 25 Days to Aden is about is the following spring, March of 2015, the Gulf states basically say this situation has to end. The Houthis begin to strike out in all directions to try and conquer the rest of the country, including its second largest city and its largest port at Aden, far in the south.
So let's talk about the Houthis for a minute, because their religious orientation is Shia, and they is that, do I have that right?
So would you like to, or shall I?
Well, it's complicated, right? Because it's not quite true, right? They're a tribe, Zaidi, right? So it's a little more complicated.
So the way to think about it is that the Houthis are actually a clan family structure, right?
And mainly from the north,
they're
which
from
is
the north,
south,
right
of
on the
Great
Saudi
Desert,
border,
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, right on the Saudi border. And the Houthis are from a sect called the Zaydis. And the Houthi part of this, the Zaydi sect is not 100% Sunni, not 100% Shia. It's sort of syncretic. It mixes elements of both. It's not unique to Yemen, but certainly some of the largest Zaydi communities in the world are in northern Yemen. And the Zaydi community used to run the imamate that ran Yemen for,
a thousand years.
That's right, over 1,000 years. Out, so before we had the Socialist Republic in 1962 come in. So this is a very important part of northern society. But what's interesting about the Houthis are that they are a small family stroke clan of religious scholars who chose to emulate the Islamic Revolution in Iran,
right, and
who chose to use Lebanese Hezbollah as their model for how to build a political Islamic movement. And they did pretty well on their own, even before the Iranians gave them a lot of assistance. The Iranians encouraged them. They brought, for instance, the leader of the Houthi movement, Badruddin, and his sons to Iran, to Hezbollah's Lebanon, even to the Iran-Iraq war battlefields in the 1980s. They encouraged them. They gave them some support. But it was the Arab Spring that gave the opportunity for Iran to really supercharge the Houthis to take advantage of the chaos inside Yemen. And, that's when they became a force between around 2010 and 2014. That's when the Houthis became a force that could actually punch well above its weight and expand beyond its northern mountain communities.
Do you think we missed an opportunity by not engaging, the West with the Houthis from the beginning? Maybe there would have been an opportunity for peace agreements, as you talk about in your book briefly, that there were an opportunity for peace talks that kind of fell through.
So when I was in Yemen in the 2000s, I felt quite sorry for the Houthis because they were in the mountains and they fought 6 consecutive wars against the Yemeni government. Those were very brutal wars in which the Houthis were really pummeled by the government with all of its military force. What I didn't realize at the time, the same way I didn't really understand it about Lebanese Hezbollah when I was in southern Lebanon, was the degree of intention within the Houthi leadership and also within the Lebanese leadership, Hezbollah leadership, to build copies of the Islamic Republic of Iran within their areas. So, they looked like the victims in the 2000s, but I don't think they were ever completely victims, even though they were victimized by the Yemeni government, a stronger Yemeni government. Over time, the Houthis became strong enough to defeat the Yemeni government on the ground in their northern areas, and then from 2010 through 2014 to actually overrun the capital. So do I think we should have engaged them in peace? The fact is, in those 6 wars from 2004 to 2010, it would have been good if the West had intervened to make the Houthis less desperate and to make northern Yemenis less open to the Houthis. Because every time, for instance, the Yemeni government would defeat the Houthis in a village, they would flatten the village. And therefore, all the other non-Houthi elements in that village would now side with the Houthis against the government. So, yes, we should have got involved at an earlier stage, and the Houthis might not have grown the way it did. The Arab Spring...
They're a very strongly idealistic, religious...
Absolutely.
You know, so they believe in the Mahdi, they believe in...
Well, nothing would have changed the Houthi family's own mindset about the need to replicate the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolution. But what didn't need to happen was that the Yemeni government didn't need to drive so many other northern Yemeni tribes into their hands with heavy-handed counterinsurgency tactics. Classic. And then in between 2011, Arab Spring, and 2014, obviously, if the Yemeni government built by the UN had been stronger, it might have been able to resist the Houthis. And at the very outset of the war crisis, between when the Houthis took Sanaa in September 2014 and when the real war began involving the Saudis as well in March 2015, there was clearly a moment there where maybe some kind of power sharing might have been possible. But the Houthis don't like to take a step backwards. So the more terrain, resources and population they control, the less likely they are to enter a peace deal. And so, yeah, undoubtedly we missed a window, but they would always have been probably very adversarial towards the West, towards Israel and towards Saudi Arabia.
And in fact, you know, they're in the news today because of the attacks that we're taking in Yemen, and because of their attacks into the Red Sea, as we've seen in the last few years, impacted commercial shipping. But the story of your book really, you know, this conversation has kind of set up us to kind of discuss where this book really begins. And the Houthis have begun to partner, obviously, with Iran as a proxy that they've identified with, and Hezbollah, because they're getting some Iranian expertise and training from that group. And then when Ali al-Abdullah Saleh fell from power, let's begin that opening scene in the book where you have this interesting amalgamation between Houthi irregular forces and what he has in terms of patronage and loyalty in the traditional military forces, and they kind of combine those together in order to try to take back over the government.
Yeah, so the once we get past the historical background, the book talks about how the Houthis tried to overrun Aden. And Aden is a long way from Sanaa, hundreds of miles. And the Houthis had to rapidly assault a city with hundreds of thousands of people in it. And they tried to take it by storm. Now, how did they do that? They needed a combination of three things. They needed their own Houthi fighters, who they trained. They needed the ousted Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the former president. Right. Now, he's been ousted by the Arab Spring and then ignored by the UN and everybody else in the years afterwards, treated as an afterthought. But all the time, he's kept his contacts within the elite forces inside the Yemeni military, the Republican Guard, the intelligence services, the Ministry of Interior, the Special Forces. So some of those elements essentially come over to the Houthis, who are partnering at that stage with Ali Abdullah Saleh, who dances on the head of snakes, this kind of tricky Machiavellian figure who stayed in power for decades and then, thinking he could ride the Houthis, tried to get the Houthis to do his dirty work for him and restore him to power. As we'll see later, it didn't quite work out that way for him. But Ali Abdullah Saleh basically helps them to create a hybrid force, a force that can use Soviet-trained, quite battle-hardened Republican Guard armored forces that can utilize Yemeni government and special forces helicopter units to do air assault and air mobility. Also, we have a number of Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah advisors in the picture who primarily assist with operational planning and logistic planning in particular. They make sure the helicopters can fly, that the food and fuel and ammunition get to the soldiers. They kind of fill in some of the organizational stuff that this hybrid force of Houthis and Republican Guard are not so good at. And as a result, the Houthis and the Republican Guard managed to first overrun the key airbase of Al Anad, which is kind of the gateway to Aden in the south. The US CIA and JSOC mission barely make it out of there before the Ali Abdullah Saleh and Houthi forces are streaming in. And then they crash into the city of Aden, and they go straight for the airport, which is the kind of geographic center of the city that connects the three different parts of the city. If you imagine Aden as a Y shape, okay, the airport is the center, the axis at the center of those three. So you control the airport, you control all three sub-elements of the city. And that's what they did. So, you know, that's the kind of force that had invaded. It wasn't large, but it was quite battle-hardened, quite determined, but sitting in a southern city, out of its element, surrounded by a big population, but unopposed by any major military force yet.
So just, again, one half step back in terms of the players here. So I think Saleh's vice president, Hadi, had basically been taken in the control of the capital, somehow escapes, but then also begins to move some of the apparatus from the mountainous city of Sanaa down to Aden and move the banks, some of the financial systems and this sort of thing. Is that why the Houthis really, and with Saleh, want to take over Aden, or are there other reasons? I mean, what's the drive to take this particular point?
Well, Aden had become the government in exile location after the coup of September 2014, when the Houthis took over control of the actual capital.
So they take the capital in the north in the mountains, but now the government itself basically moves down to the port of Aden, and they now feel like they have to drive that out into the sea or take over the entire country.
Yeah, and the process of the government kind of fleeing to Aden is one that happens between September 2014 and March 2015. But what it means is that by the time March 2015 comes up, Aden is the obvious target. It's not only the second largest city in the country, the largest port, but it's also where the government in exile is sitting. And if you take Aden, you have a port on the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean, and there's really nowhere else for the Yemeni government to go. They've got to give up at that point if they don't have the capital and they don't have the largest port and the second largest city.
So there's a movement, though, that's really worried about this. And Jane, why is that? I mean, you know, so...
I mean, presumably from a larger geopolitical standpoint, you know, the Gulf of Arabia with Saudi and the Emirates and Oman included, I mean, this is a very strategic loss if Yemen falls in the hands of the Houthis by proxy Iran, a huge regional threat, a huge beyond that global threat, right? That suddenly there's a potential loss, not only regionally, but for the strategic waterway, right? Being under Houthi control.
And if you think about to Saudi Arabia, and to an extent to other Gulf states like the UAE, but particularly to Saudi Arabia that has such a long border with Yemen and quite tight societal connections with Yemen. You know, Yemen to them is like Cuba is to us in the US or Mexico. You cannot let those places fall under control of an enemy force. And when, for instance, an enemy force places, let's say, strategic weapon systems in Cuba, we nearly go to Third World War because of it. We cannot tolerate that. And that's the same with the Saudis and Yemen. They decide in 2015 that they cannot tolerate the Iranians saying we now have control of 4 Arab capitals. And one of those capitals is right there on the Arabian Peninsula, within striking distance of Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest cities. So they say we need to do something about this. We need to put together a Gulf coalition that will restore the internationally recognized Yemeni government under President Hadi, who's fled to Aden, the UN-backed president. And we want the Houthis to accept some kind of withdrawal from Sanaa and go back to the north where they came from.
But it's not looking good. At the beginning chapters of this book, it looks like the Houthis going to take over the whole country. As you said, the U.S. had a JSOC element that was in and around Aden and fled because it looked like the whole country was being taken over as they came out of the mountains and kind of got to that first place before the beachhead. And so the U.S. has left. UK is not really there. The UN basically says, who's willing to do something about it? And as Jane says, all these Gulf states are really, really concerned relative to the Houthis and Iranian proxy then taking over all of Yemen. So,
well, one of the things that's forgotten about the start of this war, and it's detailed here, is that the internationally recognized government of Yemen go to the UN and say, we request assistance with Article 7 self-protection. We need somebody to help us. And they go to the Arab League at the same time and make a call for intervention by foreign forces. The UAE, or Saudi Arabia, the UAE, a range of other Muslim states agree to provide a military force to try and restore the government of Yemen. And that includes the almost immediate beginning of a classic air campaign that ended up lasting for nearly 4 years, on a scale that had never been launched before by an Arab military. So this was not exactly the complexity of Desert Storm in 91, not close, but in terms of effort and a major jump in terms of what they'd ever done before, this was a large, ongoing, sustained, reasonably sophisticated air campaign involving over 100 aircraft, strike aircraft, that ended up lasting for years without any U.S. assistance except for a bit of aerial refueling and some target betting.
and the other player that begins to loom extraordinarily large here are special forces and irregular forces that are surprisingly, in my opinion, I don't know this story. This is partly the subtitle of the book, The Unknown Story of Arabian Elite Forces at War. And Jane, you spent a lot of time in the Emirates, and these soldiers have been out all over the world, but particularly in Afghanistan with NATO, U.S. forces buying sophisticated equipment, and they're the ones that really step into this gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the thing I think that people don't appreciate, starting from really a point of not having a strong military, is the amount of not just capabilities, but training required to build up military power, you know, to enable forces to suddenly operate at a very high level takes years in order to develop, right? And so a lot of these Gulf states didn't have that capability. And so they were literally starting from scratch in some sense of having to develop elite forces through a lot of very quick turnaround training, as I think is very well pointed out in the book.
And the U.S. Marine Corps, you were part of this mission as well. So the U.S. Marine Corps has really, I guess, coordinated a lot of this training as part of a key mission in the Gulf with UAE in particular. And they've bought, I mean, they've got F-16s, Saudi's got F-15s. But I was amazed, they're also, the UAE forces are running Chinook helicopters, our U.S. Army Chinook helicopters, C-17 transport planes. I mean, this is the most modern transport plane that we own. And a lot of very, very sophisticated special forces kind of training that either come from MARSOC or these type of elements. What can you say about all of this? I mean, they've been buying this equipment for years, but the Marines and you as a Marine officer, you're training them to do these kind of sophisticated missions. Right.
I personally didn't train them, but I watched the trainers work alongside of them. And, you know, it just like a Marine going through basic training, there's no quick fix to developing capabilities, right? It really does take time to not only just train people to be basic soldiers, but then to deal with the sophisticated equipment required a whole different level of sophistication, which I think went underappreciated at first. Is okay, it's one thing to just buy all this equipment It's another thing to find people who can actually operate that. And so that requires an incredible amount of personnel to bring in order to operate different exquisite systems. At the same time, getting them to be interoperable too is something that even the U.S. military struggles with, right? To try and figure out across services how to get people to communicate, operate systems. So the fact that they're able to pull off a coalition of forces is quite impressive in such a small period of time.
But you're also doing sophisticated operations with U.S.-like JTACs, which are teams these are small teams that they put in on the ground that are controlling a lot of air attacks. But, you have an 8-person team that's basically calling in all sorts of firepower and capabilities that gives them the capabilities far beyond what it would look like when they're sitting and standing on the ground. And that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, that's a very, very sophisticated operation, and we see that. Mike, we'll go back to you for a second. Why does UAE make the decision here of all the Gulf states to basically lend this kind of sophisticated expertise at the time when a lot of other states are not? I mean, Saudi is obviously doing the air war and some other things, and others are participating in that. But UAE gets their hands dirty and gets on the ground, and they actually conduct some very sophisticated operations. Why do they make this decision?
Yeah, so, thinking about when you're a historian, one of the things to do is always to side rail kind of, or what's going on in the theater alongside what else is going on in the world, right? And we have the counter-ISIS campaign happening at exactly the same time. The US is certainly not looking for another mission at this moment, nor are most of the European nations are all focused on counter-ISIS. The Saudis and the Emiratis have a obvious connection to this crisis, particularly the Saudis, because of the geography. The Emiratis support the Saudis in all of their ventures at this point. They, for instance, supported Saudi troops who went into Bahrain during the Arab Spring uprisings to stabilize Bahrain. And they sent their own kind of police forces, militarized police forces into Bahrain at that time. This is an example of backing Saudi up in a bigger struggle. Now, the UAE, because it has done such long, decade-spanning deployments of special forces groups in Afghanistan alongside NATO and US, in Somalia back in the 90s, in Kosovo, sent their Apaches there to support the mission in the late 90s. In Libya, they spent special forces components to take part in the NATO mission to remove the Gaddafi government. They had the confidence to do an expeditionary operation. And as you say, they had quite a good equipment set to do it in terms of strategic airlift, in terms of a navy that could undertake amphibious operations.
And naval gunfire.
Yeah, naval gunfire support through their corvettes and frigates, and also
just landings of some very heavy equipment as well.
That's right. They were able to undertake amphibious operations, create kind of long-range airlift operations. They were able to also deploy special forces teams with US-certified JTACs. And in fact, the first JTACs graduated from the UAE's own JTAC Academy into the combat zone. And, when you think about the UAE, it's smaller than Saudi. It's not physically connected to Yemen. The UAE is a trading empire or nation that has this kind of connection all the way through the Indian Ocean basin, including to many of the coastal Yemeni cities, including a sort of a societal connection. Like a lot of the people who run major equipment hire businesses in the UAE, where, of course, everything's being built all the time, are Yemenis. Many of those who built the police forces in the UAE were Yemenis. So they have this kind of societal connection, and the UAE decides if Saudi's content to lead the strategic air campaign and the northern fronts on its border, we'll take the peripheral operations around the edges. We'll help to squash or constrain al-Qaeda from exploiting this breakout of civil war in eastern Yemen, which is what my second book's about, Race for McCullough. But in the first instance, we will stop the Houthis from taking the second largest city in Yemen and its largest port, Aden. And we're going to do that by inserting small groups of special forces to create a resistance within the city that can prevent.
They're not fighting by themselves. There's actually a southern resistance. You talk about this in the book a little bit about that they're proud and they have, but a lot of it's small arms. They don't have a lot of heavy capability. But that resistance is very important about trying to hold the Houthis back from actually completely taking over the port and completely taking over Yemen.
That's right. You know, the Houthis were unable to immediately conquer some of the pockets of the city, including the port. And local popular committees, as they were called, just urban people with guns, not even one AK per fighter, were holding them back, but they couldn't last very long. That's why the Emirates put in this special forces group with JTACs, airstrike controllers, so that they could get ground view, so that they could work out what the resistance needed in terms of resupply, particularly anti-tank munitions, so they could begin to create landing zones for things like ammunition, and so that they could more effectively guide airstrikes and blunt the Houthi attacks, particularly Houthi tank attacks, for which the resistance initially had very little answer.
You have this great passage in your book that describes the techniques that the Emiratis use to guide on aircrafts to attack basically ground targets, where they use sheep. Can you describe that a little bit about how they were able to call for fire? And
well, okay, so that was actually Houthi elements doing that bit. The Houthi elements had also. I mean, we could talk about the Houthis as an enemy, and in fact, I've done so on a number of podcasts because they're really fascinating. But to give an example, their Houthi forward observers would have a sheep on their shoulder, like a lot of Yemenis would, taking it to market or from market. If they would correct fire by basically, they move their left shoulder to say correct left, move right to control right, and there would be an observer watching the Houthi with the goat on his shoulders. So that that's an example of how the Houthis would do this low tech. An example of how the Emiratis would sort of do it high tech is that the front of the book has this beautiful painting on it from the lobby of the Presidential Guard headquarters, and it is showing the special forces, the first special forces group, helocasting into the blood-warm Gulf of Aden, rather.
And just to be clear, when he says helocasting, what you're talking about here is that Chinook, you have Zodiac boats on the back of these Chinooks. They're lowering themselves near the water, pushing the boats out, jumping in, and then doing insertions, in a very sophisticated operation. It really needs a lot of training, and this is the painting that he's talking about. It's on the side of the book.
Yeah, and so they drop into the water, and there's a very vivid description of it in the kind of preface of the book. This was the first team of 8 who went in, and when the Yemenis met them on the beach after the covert insertion, they looked at these young Emiratis, all of whom were cleanly shaven, all of whom were wearing what they thought was Yemeni civilian dress, though it didn't quite fit with the Yemenis, but it's what they thought would look right. But these young guys, they're none of them had grey hair, none of them had beards, the way Yemenis would think of tough fighters as having beards or grown men as having beards, and they were all carrying AK-47s and light weaponry because they wanted to blend in and be covert. And the Yemenis looked at them and said, what can these guys do? We're about to get overrun by a major tank attack.
There weren't a lot of them.
No, there was 8 of them, and we're about to get overrun by a major tank attack, and they sent us 8 guys and a radio. What can they do, right? But within 24 hours, this one Emirati Special Forces group had basically destroyed around 50 enemy armored vehicles using their joint terminal attack controllers, their airstrike controllers, to bring all of the coalition's air power to bear on the Houthi armored concentrations.
Early days in Afghanistan with special forces there, riding horses and basically JTACs,
Right.
bringing a tremendous amount of firepower in from these small, kind of very, very specialized.
So then when the Yemenis, I spoke to a lot of Yemeni resistance commanders and interviewed them for the book. They said after that, they may have been 8, but we looked at them as if they were 8,000.
Well, I just want to, because we're talking about an entire book, and you should read the book. It's very interesting, and it demonstrates a lot. Again, I was very impressed coming away from the book about the sophistication of the UAE forces, Presidential Guard. I think these smaller units that were very, very highly trained, spent a lot of time with NATO and the U.S., a lot of really great equipment, but they don't have an easy time of it. I mean, they originally, they are way over on the Strait of Hormuz side of things. They're operating all the way back over in the Red Sea. They originally are in Djibouti, and Djibouti kind of forces them out, and they have to move up to Eritrea, which is farther up the Red Sea coast. And so now you have a larger maritime route to get to Aden, and you're trying to get equipment all the way from home port country, in the Persian Gulf, all the way around Saudi Arabia Peninsula, and then take whatever that equipment or training units back through those narrow waters. And these are very, very difficult maritime operations, amphibious assault operations, and they're then working out of Eritrea for a while. And I just, a couple of other things. You describe a lot of equipment in the book. So G6 South African artillery, 120 millimeter mortars, drones, smaller rocket launchers, the big C-17s and movements, air bridges that they create, corvettes and others doing, and mortar boats doing naval gunfire support. They've got French tanks, very heavy tanks, lighter BMPs. They also go to MRAPs to try to get away from the IEDs, lessons that they've seen the United States difficulty with. And they're fighting the enemy, and the Houthis are not walking away from this fight. No matter what they're bringing to the fight, they're not fleeing. They are fighting tooth and nail for every block as they're trying to get down to the port. And it appears to me that in the book, there's like 6 battles. You talk about the airfield being kind of the center point. Whoever is kind of controlling the airfield might then more easily control the city and the port. So there's like 6 battles over the airfield, 5 of which these resistors basically lose. They are unable to take the airport back over. And they finally determine we need heavier armor. The air war is not enough. We need boots on the ground. Now, the Marine Corps and Army would like to hear that. But it's absolutely true. They can't get it done just with air power. And so eventually they have all these fights on the airport. Talk to us, they finally end up moving heavier armor in to kind of move with the resistance forces. And they finally end up taking over the airport in this 6th battle.
So the UAE is a relatively small nation, even though very dynamic, very rich. That means it has quite a small decision-making structure, right from the now president, Mohammed bin Zayed, down to the military operational chain. And Mohammed bin Zayed himself is quite a skilled military commander. I mean, for a head of state, he's quite an impressive military thinker. And, everybody's is obviously very complimentary about the ruler. But I mean this genuinely. He has come up so many times in the research for all 3 of the books in ways that is very easy to substantiate and cross-check. He is, it's very unusual to get a head of state who can intervene in the detail of military operations just enough, not too much, not too little, and helpfully, basically. So he could, for instance, short circuit that if you need to get a capability to the front, he can make absolutely sure that happens, whether it's a replacement drone system or, in the case of the final attack on Aden airport, whether it is over 100 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs.
That they're moving from
The UAE.
Gulf all the way to the Red Sea, and then getting on land in a contested environment. You're talking about huge vehicles.
It's huge. So what you're able to do here, because they had the foresight in the UAE to get C-17 airlift aircraft in place years before this contingency, not too many years, but just, so all this equipment they've got, whether it's Corvettes, C-17s, whatever it is, it's not old enough to be knackered and broken, but it is not too new that they haven't been able to train and familiarize on it. They got it just right. And what that meant is that they were able to airlift, over 100 heavy armed vehicles into Eritrea by just doing back-to-back-to-back airlifting, then to covertly insert all 120 of those armored vehicles into the defensive pocket in Aden without being detected by the Houthis.
I remember in the book you said that it's 10 hours or something, depending on the seas, states, and everything, to get all the way to the coast. And then they would try to insert them at like between 2 and 3 in the morning just to get 10, 20 of them on land. And then they would disappear in the darkness of night and go back for more.
That's right. They built a completely new berth out of Houthi site. And they inserted. So the Houthis, when the 6th Airport battle happened, were confronted with something that they never had before, which was a mechanized or motorized infantry force that was 100% protected mobility. None of the Houthi small arms or heavy machine guns or heavy sniping equipment could touch these guys. And that gave the Yemeni assault force the confidence that it would be able to get on target, debus out of the vehicles and spread out and clear the airport. And that's what ultimately happened. Spoiler.
Interestingly, in the analysis of what they were looking at, they had attacked the airport like 5 times, and it sounded like, well, fire support was going pretty well, and isolation and keeping the Houthis from final attacks was going pretty well, but they just couldn't get into the airport and hold terrain. And they finally said, look, this is what we need. We have to have these heavy armored vehicles. Well, where are we going to get them? How long is that going to take? And this is really where the title of the book comes from, 25 Days to Aden, because they said, well, look, it's 25 days to the end of Ramadan and to the feast day. And we have to get this done. It's got to be done now. And they put all this planning in place to try to make what you just described happen, this air bridge, this naval operation back and forth in the darkness of night, to try to get all the equipment there in these 25 days to finally take over the airport. And then finally, once that's done, they've essentially won this battle and prevented the Houthis not only from taking over Aden, but taking over the rest of Yemen and taking over the country that sits astride or over this Red Sea.
Yeah, that's right. It's, the title, what struck me was I remember interviewing the commander who had sat with Mohammed bin Zayed, and Mohammed bin Zayed said, what is the issue? Why have these first 5 attacks failed? And this commander says, it's because we lack protected mobility.
Right.
We need these MRAPs in place. Mohammed bin Zayed says, how many do you need? And he says, 30, 50 would do. He says, I'll give you over 100, but you've got to get this done in the next 25 days. Deal? And that was the deal. And they met that deal. They achieved it, ultimately. Everything from getting those vehicles out of storage, out of climate-controlled storage, fitted with external fittings, all weapons systems, all radios, all anti-armor cages, brought into theater in Asab in Eritrea, Yemeni and other personnel trained to operate with the MRAPs, covertly inserted back into the tiny pocket, the urban pocket, and then unleashed on the airport within 25 days.
That's incredible. Was there some significance to the 25 days?
It just happened to be that between there and the end of, between there and Eid, after Ramadan, it was 25 days. Yeah.
Wow.
So I think that one of the things that I took from the book was just, we're used to hearing of the expertise of UK, Australian, U.S. Special Forces, MARSOC, all sorts of long, very sophisticated, exquisite type of forces that are in operation. And here, some of the things that you talk about, Arabian elite forces at war, and the Marines have been training them for some time. They bought some very sophisticated equipment, but they've been alongside us and others in the sophisticated irregular wars of the modern age. And I know we're running out of time here a little bit. I just want to go back around the room and just see what other kind of last comments you have. And Jane, we'll turn to you for any final reflections, and then to Michael on any conclusions you've drawn since the writing of the book.
Yeah, I'm struck by, number one, your historical study of this topic, which is a difficult one to understand. First of all, it's a very complicated area. But what really struck me in reading this was your personal story of embedding with the Emiratis and what that was like for a non-trained, civilian to enter in that environment. One thing to embed as a journalist with the military, where you have all this sort of protection, but to go into the heart of a conflict alone and unafraid, what was that like?
It was a lot of fun. I never thought after the end of the Iraq mission in 2011 that I would ever have my legs dangling off the back ramp of a Chinook flying over a beautiful environment like that with a couple of Apaches escorting in the background. So for me, it was like coming home again after the 2003 through 2011 experience in Iraq, and was very gratified to have that experience. And look, I've always said this, when you embed with a force, you lose some objectivity. I didn't have a lot of objectivity about the point of this war to begin with. I was always supportive of the Gulf intervention. I felt someone needed to do it, and I'm glad they did do it. And I accept too that when you embed with forces, you come to learn to love them. But nonetheless, one thing I committed to with these books is that everything that makes it into the book is true. Everything. Some things might not make it into the book because of security reasons and other reasons, but everything in here you can take to the bank. I'm a military historian by training, and I've made very sure that this is about preserving the Emiratis' history for them. It's published in both English and Arabic, and the hope is that when this trilogy is done, it'll inspire young Emiratis to take up the tradition of history themselves, including a very accurate rendering of history that accepts when things go right, when things go wrong. It's just how it is, and you have to learn from it.
Great.
Well, Jane and Michael, I want to thank you both for joining us today on this fascinating discussion, and appreciate you joining us for this edition of the Trident, which we've named after the book, 25 Days to Aden, the unknown story of Arabian elite forces at war. And for the Trident, this is a book series with Michael Knights. And we look forward to hosting you in a few months for a follow-up discussion on book 2 in the series, which is The Race for Makalla. Both of you appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Trident, a podcast on irregular warfare. Opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the U.S. Naval War College. Please find us at www.usnwc.edu/CIWAG and consider subscribing to our bi-weekly newsletter, The Patrol, or listen to further episodes of The Trident. Until next time.